when then Secretary Nielsen was focused on managing a surge of migrants at the southern border. The Secretary cited cyber threats as her top priority. She said, and I quote, "The cyber domain is a target, a weapon, and a threat vector, all at the same time." I share her concerns, not only for federal networks, but also for the nation's critical infrastructure, because our adversaries are moving and adapting at a pace that far exceeds our own. That is why it is hard to understand why the FY2020 request once again proposes a reduction to these missions. For operations and support, the request is a reduction of 5% compared to the current year. For procurement, construction, and improvements, it is a reduction of 7.4%. If we are to outpace adversaries who seek to do us harm, this reduction appears counter to what we need to do. During this hearing, I hope that we will get some clarity on this and other aspects of your fiscal year 2020 request, and whether it realistically provides the resources you need to accomplish your missions in our ever-evolving threat landscape. Now, before I turn to the Director for a summary of his written statement, the full text of which will be included in the record, let me first recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Fleischman, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Appreciate your holding this hearing as usual and the great mutual cooperation we have on both sides of this dais. Director Krebs, good morning, sir. Thank you for coming back to discuss the fiscal year 2020 budget request for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I think we had a very good and informative oversight hearing a few months ago when we discussed election security and the cyber threats your agency is working to combat. Every day we are confronted by news of new data breaches in both the private sector and, unfortunately, occasionally a federal agency. I know your agency is committed to attacking these threats and incidents from all angles, and I thank you for that, sir. So often we focus on the cybersecurity aspect of your mission. However, the recent tragic events in Sri Lanka are a tragic reminder of the work we still must do and the important work you do at CISA and across the department to protect our cities and people going about their daily lives. I'm hopeful that the funds we provided in 2019 and the requests of 2020 will further your ability, sir, to protect our critical infrastructure. I look forward to your testimony this morning. I thank you and I yield back.
Mr. Secretary, would you please begin your statement?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, Chairman Roy Bell Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA's 2020 budget request. CISA leads the national effort to safeguard and secure federal networks and critical infrastructure from cyber and physical threats. In this sense, we serve as the nation's risk advisor. To further our efforts in this mission, it is critical that across government and industry we have clarity and a common sense of purpose on what it is we need to protect. Yesterday, I announced that we reached a new milestone by identifying a set of national critical functions. The NCFs are functions of government and the private sector so vital to the United States that their disruption, corruption, or dysfunction would have a debilitating effect on security, economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination thereof. NCFs represent an evolution in the nation's risk management efforts by focusing on how entities enable functions or services across the economy, allowing for a better understanding of cross-cutting risk factors and the increasingly interdependent nature of connected infrastructure. The National Critical Functions effort is just one example of how CISA is leading the nation's risk management efforts and will serve as a roadmap to guide CISA activities and investments in the coming years. Today, I'd like to briefly touch on 5 of those activities: protection of federal networks, election security, operational technology, supply chain risk management, and soft target security. Starting with federal cybersecurity, across the federal government, we have better IT capabilities government-wide, are on a path to standardization, and leadership awareness is at an all-time high. By issuing guidance or directives to federal agencies, providing tools and services, and implementing cybersecurity initiatives, we are protecting government and critical infrastructure networks from malicious actors. Binding operational directives have yielded significant results for cybersecurity, federal cybersecurity. For instance, we have reduced the time agencies were taking to patch critical vulnerabilities from an average of 219 days to an average of around 20 days today. In many cases, this is better than industry. But we can do better. On Monday, I issued an updated directive requiring even shorter mitigation timeframes and for a broader category of vulnerabilities. Also, in January, we issued an emergency directive to protect federal networks from a global campaign tampering with the Internet's phone book, known as DNS. This year's budget will develop efforts to centralize DNS resolution for the federal government. If implemented, we could generate a rich set of analytics that sit on top of traditional DNS services, further securing federal networks. Next, election security. Perhaps the highest profile threat today is attempts by nation-state actors to interfere with our elections. Over the last 2 years, we have become close partners with the election community. Our efforts to protect 2020, and I did bring party favors, you should all have a bumper sticker, are already underway. We will focus on broadening the reach and depth of assistance, emphasizing the criticality of election auditability, prioritizing the need to patch vulnerabilities, and developing locality-specific cybersecurity profiles that officials can use to manage risk. Operational technologies, such as industrial control systems, are also important. These components that operate our critical infrastructure, such as manufacturing, the grid, pipelines, and dams. The increasing integration and connectivity of these technologies has vastly increased the potential impact of cyber threats. Included in this year's budget is a voluntary pilot known as Cybersecurity that will deploy network sensors to detect malicious activity on critical infrastructure networks, including ICS. Supply chain is also a priority. CISA chairs DHS's seat on the Federal Acquisition Security Council. This council, established by law last December, will provide a coordinated approach to supply chain security. Our success depends on collaboration with industry experts as well. Our Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force has brought together 20 federal partners and 40 of the largest companies in the IT and communication sectors to reach consensus on how to best manage this risk. Of course, CISA also remains focused on physical threats. On Saturday, we were once again deeply saddened to learn of the tragic shooting at a synagogue in Poway, California. Far too often, our nation is confronted with another violent attack on places such as entertainment venues, places of worship, or schools. Earlier this month, CISA updated and released a resource guide on securing such soft targets in crowded places, and also takes a leadership role in ensuring school safety going forward. In closing, I'd like to thank the committee for its continued support of CISA and our mission. The authorities and resources provided over the years have helped raise the baseline of cybersecurity and mitigate countless threats to federal networks and critical infrastructures. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Director Krebs, I'd like to begin by having you give us your overall vision for federal cybersecurity, how it's different from the model that is being employed today, and the challenges that you see standing in the way of that vision.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. I like to talk about federal cybersecurity in 3 primary buckets in terms of establishing context. One, where we were, where we are, and where we need to go. So when you think back to the OPM breach and the status of federal networks then, in the intervening couple years, using authorities Congress has granted us under FISMA, including binding operational directives, there's no question we've made progress. I cited the patch patch mitigation plan, the vulnerability management that we put in place, going from 219 days for patching critical vulnerabilities to less than 20 now into the 15-day range is a significant improvement. Also on email security and web security, we issued a binding operational directive for DMARC. That has also put us at the top of the heap. So there's no question that we are better than we were several years ago. The challenge we have right now, though, is that across the civilian agencies, there are 99 different agencies that we work with to help improve cybersecurity. We do provide tools such as the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program and the National Cyber Protection System, and those are certainly providing the appropriate protections in place now. But we've got to get to a more common, synchronized baseline approach. And so later this year, we'll issue a cybersecurity baseline that will establish a common understanding and framework of where these 99 federal agencies need to go. Earlier this week also, it was announced by OMB that we'll be serving as the quality service management offering for cybersecurity services so that we will be able to offer a more standardized security operations center as a service, for example. But to continue going forward in the next several years, what I would like to see is, once again, standardized approaches to cybersecurity across the agencies, more a better harmonization across services that are provided, whether by me or other agencies. We have to continue to push awareness of threat information out there. We have to understand and increase visibility across networks, and we have to be able to act quickly across those networks.
We continue to hear about new cyber attacks on federal networks and critical infrastructure. In addition to national security concerns, these attacks often lead to the loss of Americans' private information with significant economic losses. As a general matter, do you believe the federal government is doing enough on cybersecurity, and what cyber threats are you most focused on in CISA?
So I think, again, we've made significant progress over the last couple years, but it almost sounds like a GAO report, but more work could be done. We have to continue engaging the critical infrastructure community. We have to continue sharing information on the level of the threat. When I think about the threat landscape right now for the federal networks, we are principally continuing to focus on advanced persistent threat actors, and that's nation-state actors. So that would be Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. But we are seeing an increase in hybrid threat actors. And so what you're seeing is some nation-states are using cutouts or proxies to further their agenda rather than directly engaging the military or intelligence services of those countries. So the landscape is becoming increasingly complex and diffuse. Back to the critical infrastructure space, again, we have to engage more critical infrastructure owners and operators. We have to get out there and continue to share our understanding and provide them a baseline understanding of the things that need to be done to protect their networks. And in part to those, like in the election infrastructure community, where they may not have their own resources, their internal resources, we need to be able to provide resources to those folks.
And if you had access to additional resources, what areas would you prioritize for investment?
I would scale the existing capabilities we have, the technical support capabilities we offer to our critical infrastructure partners. I would also significantly expand my ability to engage, my stakeholder engagement mechanisms. It starts by building trust, and you can only build trust by having relationships and engagement and touch points. We have to do more to get out there and engage, but once we do, we have to be able to follow through. So in addition to building those technical capabilities.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Krebs, at our last hearing, we spoke about the department's partnership with our great national labs, and specifically the top-notch work being done at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in my district in Tennessee. Does CISA have any ongoing projects at Oak Ridge National Lab, and if so, how are those projects furthering the missions and goals of CISA?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Oak Ridge has been a long-term partner of CISA and the MPPD predecessor, particularly in our chemical security efforts. In fact, Oak Ridge was I'd probably call them a plank holder in the chemical security program. So we've been doing work with them for a dozen years or so. We have at least 2 ongoing contracts right now. The one provides assistance and back-end analytic support to the chemical security assessment tool. So and this is a critical part of our chemical security efforts and will remain that's an important tool going forward.
I want to thank you for that, and I think, for the record, anytime we can leverage the investments of other agencies like at the Oak Ridge National Lab and at the Pacific Northwest Labs and bring all of our ideas together, we're doing great things for our country. So, In regard to federal agencies, the request includes $694 million for federal network protection, a vital and necessary investment for the operations of our government. I don't think there's much disagreement that these are all well-spent dollars. My first question has more to do with compliance. How do you ensure the agencies comply with the directives and recommendations for good cybersecurity practices?
We work very closely in terms of compliance with the Office of Management and Budget, but also with the leadership of the respective departments and agencies. As I mentioned, 99 agencies, 23 or so of those are CFO Act large agencies, and then you have small or medium, small, micro, and minis. We prefer to engage, I kind of left of boom, and what I mean by that is our sense of things is that we can constructively engage the CIOs and the network defenders to help them implement things like binding operational directives, so we don't have to get to a position where we're penalizing or otherwise having to, use some sort of hammer. And we have been successful in that. We have not actually been in a position to date where we've had to go any sort of name and shame campaign or anything. Again, I sense that the cybersecurity community across the federal interagency is willing and able and positively contributing to the mission. But we need to expect more, not just of us at CISA, but also of our departments and agencies. There's more work to be done. We are doing a much better job in terms of protecting federal networks, but there's more that we can do.
As an analogous question to that, sir, can more be done to encourage compliance or, if need be, direct compliance for good cybersecurity practices at the agencies?
So my sense of things right now is where I would like to go, and this also points back to the chairwoman's question. What we're increasingly finding is that in terms of cybersecurity of federal agencies, it's less about deploying tools across the networks. What we're finding is we're doing a lot of work just on the basic architecture advisory services, basic deployment and updating and upgrading and modernization of the environment, so that they're deploying more secure by design and by deployment rather than bolting on security tools. So I think going forward, one of the things that we always need to keep in mind is if you deploy and configure in a secure manner, then you're not spending a lot of money on tools on the back end.
Yes, sir. Mr. Director, do agencies incur a cost to their own budgets to do this monitoring or applying software patches?
Yes, sir. There are always going to be costs associated with IT security spend. I think if you look at industry, for example, about 4% of IT budget is cybersecurity expenditures. So there are costs associated, both people costs, tool costs, licensing costs, time costs in terms of security implementation. But again, if we can include security advisory services in just baseline IT planning and IT expenditures, then I think we'll be getting some economies of scale and efficiencies down the road.
Yes, sir. One final question. Do you have any suggestions on how we can help educate our colleagues and subcommittees that these investments are just as necessary as grants or other programs with organized constituencies?
Yes, sir. I think just like anything else in the cybersecurity space, conversation, awareness building. I go out and brief boards of directors and C-suites of critical infrastructure across the country. I see Congress as a board of directors. And so I think anything we can do to help share our understanding of the threat environment, share our understanding of the things that we need to be doing in the various agencies, whether that's briefing to subcommittees, happy to contribute to that effort.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Rupesberger.
Okay, has this been working? Yeah. So first thing, Director Krebs, I think you're doing a good job. You've got a big job, a lot of issues, not only educating the public, but educating us in Congress. There are a lot of people in Congress that really know a lot more. So keep doing what you're doing. First, Chairwoman, I want to thank you for having this hearing. It's the second time we've had you here. That's, in my opinion, very positive, because I think we need to make cybersecurity a high priority. And we have a long way to go, as you know, our entire .gov system and what we're doing in the whole country. And the more that we can focus with you and you can work with us and we can help you with your resources, the better we're going to be. Because it's a serious threat. An example of that, and then that's going to be my question, but I think Commerce since 2017 said that we have over $600 billion stolen. and that's in academia, that's in medical, that's in space, that's in, you know, wherever we go, and a lot of it's China, but there are other countries too that are stealing a lot. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for making this issue a priority. My question, last week I think you spoke at the Atlantic Council's International Conference. See, we're following you around. We know what you're doing. We're your board of directors. Okay. On cyber engagement, and you highlighted, among other items, the continued intellectual property theft assault assault on our country by foreign adversaries. The U.S. Trade Representative, as I said, estimated in 2017 there was over $600 billion that was stolen. We need to deter bad actors while simultaneously providing support and security to those who need help. Now, in your opinion, how important is the Department of Homeland Security Emergency Directive Authority? Can you give us some studies or examples of how the use of emergency directive has helped improve security, and highlight any items in your FY20 budget that incorporate lessons learned from previous emergency directives? Did you get it?
Yes, sir. Thank you. The Emergency Directive Authority, and thank you for the Atlantic Council reference. That was a good event, and I had some interesting Q&A, and I think your staff was there for that. The Emergency Directive Authority is an important tool in the toolkit that we use sparingly, and we use it in a pragmatic fashion. We used our first emergency directive earlier this year in January during the government shutdown. I think I spoke about that in the last time I was with you. But there was, we had, working with industry, had detected a global scale DNS tampering campaign. Effectively, as I mentioned in my opening, messing around with the internet's phone book. We have included in the 2020 request a line that would allow us to, that would put us on a path to implement a more holistic approach to DNS management across the federal government, rather than agencies doing their own DNS records management. This would put us on a path to more centralized services that would allow us the ability to lock down DNS, as well as understand how the adversary may be exploiting DNS. As it so happens, malware tends to communicate with its C2, its command and control infrastructure, oftentimes using DNS. So it would put us on top of that, be able to see it and stop it. We actually have modeled this in part after an approach the United Kingdom has taken with their public DNS service, the National Cybersecurity Center, my counterpart in the UK. They have taken, they're implementing this service, and so we're looking at their success, and this is a bit of an example of how I look at my international partners as a bit of a test lab. So if I see good things that other countries are doing, I try to bring it back here. And so this is just one example, but it is also informed by our January experience with emergency directives.
Also, as you know, the network is 80% of the network is controlled by the private sector. Do you work closely with the key players and the people who know what they're doing in the commercial side?
Yes, sir. Between the ISPs, the registrars, the registries, we have a network of partners, and we work with them in a couple different ways. But we have some of them within the National Communications Center at our NKIC facility in Virginia. We actually have telco representatives and ISPs. What NKIC is? As the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, you're all welcome to come over and visit. I invite you to come, and we can do a tour. Show you what our capabilities are and who the partners across both the federal government and the industry that sit with us. But yes, we have those strong partnerships, and really those are key. I've said it before, but I see CISA we sit at the intersection of the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, law enforcement, and industry. And in many respects, particularly the government conversations, we're the advocate for industry within the federal government. So it is important that we have close relationships and co-location with our industry partners.
Thank you. Okay.
Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Krebs, welcome. Thanks for being back with us and sharing with us your priorities of carrying out your mission of protecting our cyber infrastructure as well as our physical infrastructure in the country. It's increasingly important. As you mentioned, you said something like you have to engage more with our partners in infrastructure, and if there's anything that we can do to help you with that, I would certainly be interested in whether it's law changes, resources, whatever it is that we need to provide for you to help you do your job, let us know. Something that's come to my attention recently, and I've actually seen examples of this, is something called, I believe it's deep fakes. And as that technology seems to be improving and growing, people can falsely disseminate information with the use of a smartphone. And I guess I'm not saying we need to monitor U.S. citizens by the federal government. However, how do we combat the use of this, of getting false information out there that could, have a truly negative impact on a lot of different things? Are we prepared to combat these kinds of technologies that are emerging? And I'd just like to hear what your perspective is and where we are on this kind of emerging technology.
Yes, sir. Deepfakes are certainly a concern, and essentially what we're talking about here is whether a video that's been doctored or otherwise manipulated to appear as if someone is saying something they didn't say. Same thing can go for audio. I think if you look back to the way some of our adversaries, particularly the Russians, but also potentially the Chinese, have how they're engaging in influence campaigns. If you think about the way the Russians in the 2016 election manipulated social media, there are certainly opportunities for them to use things like deep fakes to confuse the public, to continue to divide. It is an area of focus for the federal research community and the intelligence community and law enforcement to understand what the kind of the emerging trend lines are and what the capabilities are, who has those capabilities. But ultimately, my sense of things, and this is one of those things we're working towards as we build up towards 2020, but is educating the American public on what the trusted sources of information are, how to think more critically about information that's anonymously posted online, whether it's a video or on social media or whatever. But that is probably the greatest challenge ahead of us. So when I think about the election security piece, yes, protecting state and local governments and their networks is hard, but it's manageable. Working with campaigns to help protect their infrastructure, that's hard, but it's manageable. The social media thing and really increasing the resilience of the American people to withstand or be able to identify issues like this, that's going to be the big challenge ahead of us.
What I've seen so far, the examples, I don't know if you've seen this, Madam Chair, but videos of people that you would recognize, and their mouths are making the words, but it's kind of rudimentary at this point. But as with everything, it will get more sophisticated.
And how much more sophisticated does it actually need to be before it's good enough?
Yeah.
So again, we think back to there are a couple examples of things that we saw in 2016 in the state of Ohio. There was a video posted on social media of that a user had claimed that a voting machine was malfunctioning and the vote was being changed. The Secretary of State contacted us. We were able to pass that over to the social media company. Working with them, they were able to determine that it was a doctored video. So maybe in some sense it is like a deep fake. They were able to debunk that, get the information back to the Secretary of State, who was then able to put out a statement and say, you know what, this is not true. It was doctored. It's been removed. And that all happened within a very quick time frame, less than a couple hours, really. So there are ways to combat it if you can connect the players who can debunk and then the people that are hosting. So what we're doing is working through on our side some of the frameworks and mechanisms for identifying, debunking, and removing content.
Good. All right. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very
Yes, sir.
much. Again,
Thank you.
thanks for being here, and look forward to working with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam.
I'd actually like to give you a little bit more time to respond to Mr. Newhouse's opening statement in terms of what it is that we can do more to be helpful.
So I thank you for that because I actually took notes. I was thinking specifically, look, I have really good tools, but I could have the best tools in the world, but if I don't have the ability to engage my stakeholders, then they're worthless. So I need to get more ability, more people, more mechanisms, more tools to get out there, engage the critical infrastructure community. We're talking thousands and thousands and tens of thousands. Elections is just is one example. So in 2018, we worked with all 50 states and 1,400 local jurisdictions. The challenge here is that there are 8,800 local election jurisdictions. So I've got a delta that I've got to match. How do I do that? I need people engaging. I need to work with stakeholder groups. That, it's not so much authorities. I need time. You know, that's one thing you can't buy, but I need more time and I need more resources. Congress has given us $59.4 million in the past 2 years, 18 and 19, for election security work. We're requesting in this year's president's budget about $22.3 million for election security work. When you think about that, that's over $80 million in terms of dedicated election money. That is going to help us continue to push out. But again, I need time, I need people, and I need resources to get out there. And once I do get make that positive contact and the requests come in for support, I do have good tools, but the bandwidth I have for tool delivery right now is not going to match what I suspect the requirement base is going to be. State and local governments is just one example of we could really solve a lot of the nation's problems if we had the ability to engage on a daily basis and provide them tools. And if you think about the National Critical Functions list that we issued yesterday, 55 national critical functions. One of those is election security. Congress has invested to date $60 million in one critical function, potentially another 22.3. So that gives us, as I mentioned in my opening, a roadmap as we prioritize which of those functions are the most important. How do we think about the investments that need to be dedicated or put against each of those functions going forward?
So if I may, Madam Chair, thank you for expounding on that. It's not a reluctance on the part of the 8,800 jurisdictions around the country or the managers of dams and pipelines and grid throughout the country. It's more an issue of our ability as the federal government to respond to those requests and needs.
It's going and finding the stakeholders. It's engaging with the stakeholders. Not everybody, particularly across the small and medium business cohort, don't have the resources to engage, particularly in Washington, D.C. through an advocacy or a trade association. So we've got to get out there in the field. Okay. That's one part of it. The other part is just basic awareness. For too long, I think we've kind of glossed over the fact that there are nation states out there that are trying to do us harm. We've got to continue to push the message that, yes, there are risks, particularly as we continue to connect to cyberspace. In 2016, one of the biggest challenges as we engage state and local election officials is the initial disbelief that they were on the front lines of a nation-state attack, that a state in the Midwest may be a target of the Russian GRU. We have to get past this. As you plug into the internet, you're in the game. You're in the global game in the cybersecurity space.
Thank you.
Ms. Bing, thank you for your patience.
No problem. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and thank you, Director Krebs, for being here again. Appreciate your work and updating us, and as a new member of the subcommittee, I'm learning a lot as well. As you know, federal investments in scientific research and higher education are critical to our national security, maintaining American leadership and innovation and fostering economic growth and jobs. We know current and future threats to our country's cybersecurity are varied and constantly evolving. Given CISA's mission, along with efforts in DHS science and technology on cybersecurity, what is CISA's academic outreach strategy for cyber research and development? How can we maybe be helpful even in our local districts with our academic and or business partners and allies? I'm concerned also about the FY2020 budget request, which includes a reduction of over $17 million from R&D for cyber. You know, what R&D activities or programs will be affected or cut with this decrease in funding? And forgive the long question.
Thank you for the question. I actually had the opportunity yesterday to testify in front of the House Homeland Security Subcommittee on Cyber and Infrastructure and Innovation alongside Bill Bryan, the senior official responsible over at the Science and Technology Directorate. And one of the things that I've known Bill for years, and one of the things that we committed to when we both came into our leadership positions here at the department was that we were going to work together, that we were going to harmonize our efforts, that we were not going to work at cross purposes, and we were not going to work independent of each other. And what Bill has done over in S&T through his revitalization program is turned S&T into a very customer service focused organization. And I have embeds from S&T that sit with my team that work regularly with my chief technology officer and are able to identify R&D requirements across CISA and then feed those into the S&T pipeline. Now, Bill does have other cybersecurity stakeholders across the department, Coast Guard, ICE HSI, Secret Service. So I'm not the only customer, but I'm able to push over requirements, and he has an understanding of where I want to go. And the best part about this is there are really no surprises. So he's not doing something that may ultimately undermine one of the efforts that I'm doing. That has not always been the case. There have not been strong relationships between S&T and previously NPPD. So that was one of those things that we're all in this together, and it's important that we work it together. So understanding that there have been some puts and takes in the budgets, regardless of where the R&D money lands, whether in my budget or Bill's budget, we'll get the job done. The cybersecurity research and development across the Department of Homeland Security will be done in a professional, coordinated, and ultimately impactful manner.
Thank you. I have another question about the Einstein system, which looks for known threats. What is in place to protect our federal networks from unknown threats? Einstein provides, physical protections of information going in and out of government premises. Also wanted to know what steps are being taken to protect this information through cloud computing, mobile type networks, and how does Einstein address those?
So thank you. I think I spoke about this a little bit the last time I was with you. The way that we think about Einstein, it's actually wrapped up in a bigger program called the National Cyber Protection System. And there are a couple different line items within, or work streams within the NCPS. One of them is just basic net flow monitoring, and that's looking at really what's happening across the networks for forensic purposes. And then we have an intrusion detection system. And then finally, the E3 Einstein 3 Accelerated, which is taking classified signatures. And it's important to note that it is the only classified signature capability available within the civilian space, commercial or government. It is the only game in town, and we find significant value out of it in terms of targeting nation-state campaigns against federal networks. But based on the information that we've been able to collect over the last 10 years or so, whether it's from the net flow, the detection system, or the protection, the prevention system, we are in we're in the pilot phase of predictive analytics. So we have the ability to understand just in terms of looking for anomalous behavior. So it's not about it's a signature, it's communicating with a certain DNS. We actually have the ability to say that user usually isn't online at that time, or that user usually doesn't log in from that address or location. And that is, again, part of the predictive analytics bucket that we're able to, and we will be rolling that out in the future. But again, what we need is the people and the resources to scale that over federal governments. We're still in the early days. We have some requests in the 20 budget, but my hope is that in the future years, that as we really build this capability, we're going to be able to invest in that and really roll it out. I think it will be a significant game changer.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Rutherford.
And thank you, Director, for being here this afternoon. And I don't know how you sleep at night with some of the issues that you face.
I didn't last night, but that's because I have 5 kids and 2 of them were sick all night. So different story.
So cyber's nothing for you then. But listen, let me ask you just a sidebar question real quick. The KSAs that are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed within the cyber world, and the ability to create innovation. How does America compare to some of our peer adversaries? Are we in good shape, or are our universities turning out individuals that are capable of defending us and creating that innovation that we need to stay one step ahead of
So
adversaries?
that's a really interesting question, and I've thought about this in a couple different lights, and it's been something that's been top of mind for me over the last several months, particularly as we think about the continued online aggression by, in part, looking at China, for instance. They're continuing to come in and steal our intellectual property. They're setting up a system of laws, whether it's the intelligence law, the cybersecurity law, that compel U.S. companies to turn over information as they come into that market. They're using Chinese students to come into our universities and steal intellectual property and research and take it back. But ultimately, what I have hope about and optimism about is that any way you cut it, I still think the United States of America is the best place in the world to live, to work, to innovate. If you have an idea, you can bring it forward here. Look at the companies that Silicon Valley alone, but increasingly other technology and innovation hubs across the country, in all parts of the country, flyover country or not. It's still the best, most innovative place to work. So I have hope that today and in the long term, we're still churning out the capabilities we need. But at the same time, the threat landscape it's not that the threat landscape is evolving so quickly, it's that our understanding of the threat landscape is what's evolving. And there is a technology deficit and there is a workforce deficit. Just yesterday on the Senate side, a cyber workforce rotational program came out. Senator Peters, Ranking Member Peters was the original sponsor, I think. And so when that comes over to the House, that would be a useful tool across, I think, the federal government to start moving people around so that we get standardization of experiences and we can upskill some folks. The administration is looking at a number of different workforce innovations, and I expect imminent action out of the White House on that. So we're making progress there, but we got to think about the existing talent pool and getting them in the right spot, whether it's through cross-training, upskilling. We have to think about the education pipeline, our K through 12. As I've already talked about 2 of my kids, I got 3 more. I want to make sure that when they hit the workforce, that they have the tools and talents needed. So it's STEM and STEAM investments. We've got to do a better job at the education. And that's not just the federal government. That's an all-of-nation effort. So that is, if industry really wants to be, the technology industry in particular wants to be setting the global pace, they need to invest in their local communities as well. And then also it's the educators. Without the educators, the K through 12 system and my kids aren't going to have the tools they need.
You mentioned that one thing that we can help you with is one of the challenges that you face is more engagement of the 55 identified critical infrastructure areas out there. Of those 55, are they in some rank order? You have.
So that is the precise next question. So historically we have been looking through the critical infrastructure community as 16 sectors, which is useful in terms of organizing across the economy in a kind of artificial way. But what we were doing with the national critical functions was looking more systemically. What are the things that the sectors deliver, and how do they interrelate? So you can't have energy without telecommunications and water and finance. Right. You can't have finance without telecommunications and energy. So we're trying to map these interconnections. As we look at the 55 national critical functions, we also have to keep in mind that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So we will have to do some analysis, and that is what we're going to do next. We'll be kicking off a prioritization process, and that'll allow us to figure out where we need to dedicate resources, how to align initiatives that various departments and private sector initiatives. So I'm very excited. This is an evolution in the way we think about risk management, and it will, I think, really help inform both your efforts as well as mine.
Okay. I see my time's expiring.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Krebs, it's good to see you again. When you were here in March, if you recall, I asked you how we could have confidence that the administration is taking the threat to our election system seriously, given President Trump's insistence that Russia did not interfere with the 2016 election. And at the time, you told me, and I'll just remind you of what you said, I quote, "I've been in meetings with the president when he said he believes the intelligence community report." And quote, "I take him at his word." Now, I was reminded of our exchange last week when the New York Times published an article stating that in the months before she was forced to resign, former DHS Secretary Nielsen tried to focus the White House on preparing for new and different Russian forms of interference in the 2020 election, you know, I guess trying to actually live the hashtag, but was told by Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney not to bring the issue up in front of the president, since he still equates discussion of malignant Russian election activity with questions about his legitimacy. According to the article, Secretary Nielsen eventually gave up on her effort to organize a White House meeting of cabinet secretaries to coordinate a strategy to protect next year's elections. So, Director Krebs, has the president received a briefing from DHS on potential Russian interference in our elections in 2020?
So, generally speaking, as I mentioned in the last hearing, I have been in some meetings with the president. I haven't been in all meetings with the president, but he did agree with the intelligence community assessment. In fact, he's on the record in front of the camera.
Has he had a briefing?
From me personally, no, ma'am, he has not.
Has he had a briefing from anyone in your department, in your agency? Are you aware of the president receiving a briefing from DHS on potential Russian interference in our elections in 2020?
And the 2020 efforts, not that I'm aware of from 2020. I know I've talked to Acting Secretary McAleenan several times over the last couple weeks, and I worked very closely with Secretary Nielsen on this issue.
Right, okay. But if this is if we're really taking this seriously and having it be more than hashtag Protect 2020, then one would hope that the President of the United States would be briefed and be fully aware of the risk and be a part of directing what it is that should happen in order to actually protect our elections in 2020. So has an interagency strategy to protect next year's elections been developed despite Secretary Nielsen's inability to organize a White House meeting of cabinet secretaries? And when can we expect a briefing on that strategy?
So we're working, the various departments and agencies are working on their elements right now in coordination with the National Security Council. Director Coates was pretty clear about that in his statement last week, that we are working together. We have a plan. We're pulling the pieces together. In terms of a overarching briefing on a strategy, my hope is that just like last summer, when we did an all-House classified briefing and we did an all-Senate classified briefing, my hope is that we can pull that again, together again soon.
That would be incredibly helpful. Did the former secretary ever express frustration to you that she was unable to organize a cabinet-level meeting on election security with the president?
I was surprised by a number of things in the New York Times article. I have no evidence or indication that any of those anonymous sources, that anything they said was true. Secretary Nielsen and I worked very closely on election security efforts, and she never mentioned anything.
So she wasn't trying to organize a cabinet-level meeting?
No, ma'am. What I'm saying is that she never mentioned to me that she was told not to bring it up with the president.
But she was trying to organize a meeting, and that meeting didn't happen.
Ma'am, I don't know specifically whether, what her specific conversations with Mulvaney were, or the Chief of Staff.
Okay. Again, trying to assess the seriousness of the administration's commitment to protecting 2020, last week, President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner characterized Russian interference in the 2016 election as a couple of Facebook ads. Is that a fair characterization? And how would you characterize the depth of Russia's interference in the 2016 election? So
I think the intelligence community, and I didn't see this specific interview, but the intelligence community was very clear. The intelligence community assessment of January 17, the DOJ indictments were very clear on the Russian efforts. The Mueller report very clear on Russian efforts.
So it was far deeper than a couple of Facebook ads. the Russian interference with the
there were
2016
there were three
election?
distinct lines of effort attempting to interfere and intervene with state and local election officials. There were hack and leak campaigns against the DNC, and there were the social media Discord campaign, which continues to this day. It's not just election focused. They generally speaking, the Russians are attempting to divide Americans along any issue that is potentially exploitable.
Lastly, before my time expires, Kushner also claimed that investigations into election interference by Russia have been way more harmful than the interference itself. Do you agree with Jared Kushner that investigations into election interference have been more harmful than the interference itself?
Man, it was the Mueller investigation was a duly authorized investigation by the Department of Justice. I think the Volume 1 builds on the intelligence community assessment and prior indictments.
We're going to need more than a hashtag. I trust your commitment to it, but making sure that this commitment goes to the highest levels, all the way up to the President and the White House. Perhaps you need to make sure that the folks in the White House understand the depth of what we experienced in 2016 and really commit to making sure that we can never allow it to happen again.
Yes, ma'am. We're all in.
I hope all really means all.
That concludes round one, so we're going to have a second round. Mr. Director, you stated that addressing a supply chain risk is one of your top priorities for CISA. Could you help us better understand the threat and its scope and what activities CISA is engaged in to mitigate that threat?
Yes, ma'am. So supply chain is one of those areas that, as I've talked about, our better understanding of risk, the more we understand the risk landscape, I think the more we're finding that more work we have to do. Supply chain is probably the area where that's most apparent. We have two kind of central lines of effort within the department right now within CISA. One is on the federal network side. So thanks to Congress's action last year, we have just since stood up the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Council. The first meeting was held yesterday, in fact, and Assistant Director Manfra of the Cybersecurity Division within my agency is the DHS chair of the DHS representative to the council. That will focus on how to enable better federal acquisition processes, including building on some of the learnings we have from the Kaspersky Antivirus Binding Operational Directive. We will be able to issue exclusion orders to take action on certain procurements or actions, products, services that may be across the federal enterprise. So very hopeful that this will help evolve the way that we manage risk. And the idea ultimately is to get us into a better kind of left of boom or left of procurement, pre-procurement position where we're making better decisions and we're getting contracting officers and people that actually write the RFPs to have the appropriate understanding of how to get the best outcome, so we don't have to tell people to pull stuff out down the road. So federal side, and then on the industry side, as I mentioned in my opening, we have an ICT supply chain task force, 20 federal government agencies, 20 IT sector companies, 20 communications companies, and that was stood up last summer after the National Risk Management Center was opened. And the concept here with the task force is to bring folks together and first and foremost get an understanding of what everyone is doing across the federal space and the industry space. So have an inventory of what all the supply chain tools, capabilities, resources are. And then beneath that, there are four other work streams. First is what is the right bidirectional threat sharing framework? So if I have information on something like Kaspersky in the future, how do I get that out into industry? And how does industry share something that they may find that would be concerning in their supply chains? Number two is an actual risk assessment framework for making sure that we're talking about risk in the supply chain, not just the threat, but the actual impact and the potential consequences of a vulnerable or an exploitable piece of hardware or software. How do we talk about that consistently? And so, it's not Tower of Babel like conversations. We're using the same language. Third is figuring out what the elements of a qualified bidders list and qualified manufacturers list would look like, so we can have whitelist isn't the right way to put it, but we know where to go for trusted procurement. We know where to go for trusted products and services. And lastly, kind of similarly, what are the incentive structures that we need to put in place for both federal procurement and private sector procurement to encourage buying from original equipment manufacturers and authorized resellers, to eliminate the counterfeit threat and white labeling? We still see, even in the federal government, shadow IT, where people can use P cards to go buy things off eBay and others that may not be what they claim to be. That could be some, there could be a case where a product offered by, for instance, one of the companies restricted by Section 889 from the last year's NDAA. There could be something from one of those companies that has been white labeled, meaning they take the label off of it and then they give it to somebody else and they put their label on it, and then that enters into the supply chain. So we need to be thinking not just one hop, but 2, 3, 4 hops out in terms of eliminating risk.
Okay, and what more could be done if additional resources were provided, and does the 2020
Off point for $2 to $3 million for our supply chain efforts to put staff against our supply chain risk management efforts within the National Risk Management Center. But my sense of things is this will be the conversation, or this will be what really drives the risk management conversation in 2 to 3 years, is the supply chain piece. So we've got to continue bringing supply chain risk management experts into the department. We have to continue to build the mechanisms for conversation in the frameworks for the federal government. But ultimately, in terms of actual managing the federal government space, I'm going to need tools. I'm going to need to bring in tools, for instance, to improve we do supply chain risk management assessments of the CDM approved products list, but I think we can probably do more. I think we can go deeper. I think we can continue to expand our understanding of relationships across vendor-supplier relationships.
Okay, after this hearing, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about some of those ideas.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Director Krebs, yesterday afternoon, we met with Acting Administrator Gaynor in a hearing on FEMA's 2020 budget request. This year, FEMA is requesting $9.6 million to modernize 5 more sites of the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, IPAWS, and $18.3 million to fund, among other IT investments, improved resilient communications and remediate cybersecurity vulnerabilities. CISA's request includes $167 million for emergency communications as well. How does your mission to protect communication as a critical infrastructure sector intersect with FEMA's mission of first responder and recovery agent?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. This is an area of the agency that I actually don't get to talk about as much as it really deserves. So the Emergency Communications Division within CISA is responsible for ensuring the interoperable communications of public safety, first responders, and law enforcement across the country. And it's less about providing technical capabilities, actually deploying the communications devices and the networks, but it's more about establishing a framework, including the National Security Emergency Communications Plan. But the framework within which our state, local, federal responders all interoperate, meaning regardless of where you sit, what jurisdiction, what level of government, in the event of a crisis or a response event, you can interact, you can talk. That was one of the key learnings coming out of the 9/11 Commission. We're continuing to push into this effort. So a lot of this for us is capacity building. It's getting out there, doing training on SafeCom, for instance. We do a significant amount of engagement. This is kind of my earlier point about the more I can engage, the more successful we'll be. ECD, its bread and butter for the last 15 years or so, when it was previously the Office of Emergency Communications, has been just a steady diet of getting out there, working with first responders. They have an incredibly cooperative and positive relationship with their stakeholders, and it is really, truly driving results, including as we think about the deployment of FirstNet right now, which Mr. Gaynor may have spoken about. But there's more to do here as well. So it's not just about being able to interoperate, be able to speak seamlessly, but they're now increasingly, particularly as we go to next gen 911 and things like that, there will be cybersecurity risks that we're introducing to operations. And emergency responders have been traditionally physical responders, but we need to make sure that they're aware of some of the cybersecurity risks that are within the technologies that they're using.
Yes, sir. And how are the two funding initiatives different, and could you do one without the other, sir?
That's I haven't thought about it from that perspective, but I think they all serve their own purposes, and I think they're important. And we work very closely with FEMA. We work very closely with the IPAWS team, and I think going forward, they absolutely serve the very important independent purposes.
Yes, sir. The attacks in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday were a somber reminder of why we need security agencies. The budget includes a $1 million increase for the Bomb-Making Materials Awareness Program and transitions the initiative to a program of record. In this unclassified setting, sir, can you say how this additional $1 million will be used in 2020, and what metrics will we use to achieve these funds?
So BMAP, the bomb-making awareness program, materials awareness program, is a hugely successful effort for us. What the additional $1 million will do, and in addition to making it a program of record, will allow additional modules to be added. I've talked a lot today about stakeholder engagement. It will also allow us to continue to expand our ability to engage across the stakeholder community. One thing to think about is and I was staying in the unclassified space, is the way the threat streams are changing a little bit. We have historically been, whether it's the CFATS program or our chemical security voluntary programs, what we're seeing is a bit of a shift in how the adversary is using chemicals in commerce, and bomb-making awareness is one of those things, is how we can, whether it's in the private sector or state and locals, give them the right cues so that they can look for things that might be included in a bomb, so that they can, see something, say something.
Thank you, Director Krebs. I've appreciated your testimony. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I just wanted to briefly follow up on one of my questions about what more we can do back home or locally. You've talked about the importance of investment in STEM technology and obviously R&D. What more can the academia world or our corporate allies, what more should they be doing? Have you, in New York, for example, have you been able to have conversations, discussions with corporate allies and what more they can be doing, whether it's STEAM education or just R&D investments in general?
Absolutely. This is one of those questions that I could spend the rest of the day talking about. I think the things we need to do. Ultimately, any way you cut it, particularly on the cybersecurity side, success is going to depend on collective efforts. It's a shared responsibility. I need to be putting people in a position where they can make the right decisions or the appropriate decisions to manage their risk in the right way. But that is not just about deploying a patch. That is also about engaging locally in the community. That is about investing in future technologies, but doing it in a way that ensures that it's done in a secure manner. I think there are a number of things I could point to recently that are good examples of how industry is engaging. Just a couple weeks ago, a few companies, MasterCard, Workday, Microsoft, and a couple others launched something known as the Cyber Talent Initiative, where they'll help pay for college for a couple for students, either in graduate or undergraduate programs, and then working with the federal government will be provided jobs, and then it's sort of a scholarship program. They come in, they work for us, and then they can go back out into industry. That's just one example of how we're seeing investments in the education pipeline. I think those are important to keep up. R&D, of course, the federal government does invest, whether it's in QTEL, DARPA, HSARPA, whatever it is, we'll continue to invest in research based on the requirements that we have developed or identified. But anyway you cut it, the industry, whether it's the high-tech community or whatever, will continue to be really pushing the innovation in the United States. Now, what I think they can do more of is, as you look at the global marketplace, as you think about countries like China, it's an opportunity for sure for revenue. It's an opportunity for potential advanced partners, but there are significant risks and threats that go along with it. There is a very clear agenda on part of the Chinese government to outpace, outstrip, and John Demers from DOJ says rob, replicate, and replace. So we are at risk long term of losing our competitive advantage in the world. There are a couple battle lines being drawn right now, and I think 5G is probably one of those. But we have got to continue to invest. We have to have our companies and our organizations, as they engage in the marketplace, need to be thinking beyond the next quarter or two and think about the next 5 years or so. Think on behalf of the shareholders long term. Don't just hand over your source code when you go engage in certain markets. Protect your intellectual property. The same thing, as I've already mentioned, goes for the academic community here. When you think about students that are coming in, it's not about limiting the students. It's about understanding what's valuable, what research you're doing is valuable, whether it's a federally funded grant, whether it's an industry funded grant. Understand what's valuable in your networks, protect it, limit the access as appropriate, but understand that what we have is valuable, but at the same time we need to ensure that particularly in the academic community, that open, that the ethos of open engagement and academic exploration continues, again, to drive that innovative and competitive edge.
Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, Director Krebs, thank you for being here with us today. You've talked a little bit about the efforts along the lines of ensuring our elections process is safe and secure. And in your written testimony, you discussed a lot of the things leading up to the 2018 election that the agency engaged in, tabletop exercises and different things. Could you talk a little bit about what's planned for 2020, some of the, maybe taking what you learned in 2018, and also how you're addressing some of the deficits that you've identified in state and local governments?
Yes, sir. So I always like kind of telling the story of where we were, where we are now, and where we need to go. So in 2016, when the federal government began to understood what was going on and realized that there was this important election infrastructure out there that may be susceptible to exploitation or attack, we didn't necessarily know who the stakeholders were. We didn't know who the secretaries of state were. We didn't know who local officials were. So there was a lot of catch up, and it wasn't even about building trust then. It was just trying to figure out who they are and get stuff into their hands. And there was not any trust. There was a lot of concern that what is historically by statute and tradition owned or managed by the state and local governments was going to be overtaken by the federal government, and that's obviously something that we're not interested in doing. But there was a lot of just
Suspicion.
discovery. There was suspicion, but yes, definitely discovery. So in terms of the run up to 18, what we were doing was building trust and sharing information on what the threat was, and then basic tools and capabilities. So it was kind of that upward climb. Now we have, as I mentioned earlier, relationships and engagement with all 50 states, and that level of engagement grows every single day. We have states that are looking to do new things with us on every single day. In addition, there's those 6,300 or so additional jurisdictions, or 7,500 jurisdictions that we've got to engage. That is, again, going to take time and just steady diet of engagement. And it's not just about going direct to the election officials, but it's also working with their supply chain. So there are vendors out there that provide election management services to thousands of stakeholders. So we need to work with that group of folks, and then we can ride in on them to engage the election officials. But in terms of specifics for 2020, again, it's reaching as many of those officials as possible. It's really improving our understanding of where the risk lies in the system. What are those things that are vulnerable? What are those things that have the highest consequence? What are the things that have the highest likelihood? And conversely, what are the things where there's the lowest likelihood of exploitation? So we can inform the conversation the right way, so not every little vulnerability that pops up is the end of the world, because ultimately what we're trying to do is, yes, protect the system so it can't be exploited, but we have to restore confidence in the electoral process, because what's at stake here is fundamentally it's democracy. Through that process, we'll also be pushing, just like we're doing on the federal government side, but patch management, really getting folks in a position that they patch. We're still seeing some cases where it's taken too long to patch critical vulnerabilities. We'll do that, but ultimately, getting to auditability, getting to end-to-end auditability across the systems, whether that's through hand-marked paper ballots or whatever. We've got to get to a position where we have confidence that we can work back through the system and understand how that vote was cast and that it was counted correctly.
Okay. Well, thank you. Again, thank you for your testimony.
And on the resource front, didn't address that. There is a technology deficit. There is equipment out there that's in some cases 15 years old. I've talked before about 5 states that still have these DREs, the no paper trail machines. They're all pretty much on a path by 2020 to remove those machines and put other machines that have some kind of paper or auditability within those systems. But in some cases, we're still seeing lack of investment at the state legislature side. There are a couple states that are trying to sort it out. They either don't have it in their general fund available or for whatever reason. So the money's going to have to come from somewhere. I personally don't care where it comes from, but we need to get those machines in place, or the paper process in place so that we can have auditability across the system.
Right. I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director, two quick things, and I'll wrap up. As America's energy production continues to rise, particularly in natural gas, and we're moving it all around the country from where it's being produced to where it needs to be used. And my district has a lot of natural gas storage and transportation issues. Can you talk a little bit about the cybersecurity? I'm sure that's one of the 55 infrastructure.
In fact, pipelines are, yes, sir.
Yeah. So how can you, in an unclassified way, I guess, can you talk a little bit about how well we're protecting that?
Absolutely. So in fact, Director Coates in the Worldwide Threat Assessment mentioned the security and cybersecurity of pipelines specifically in an unclassified manner. Last year, we kicked off with TSA and FERC and DOE and our industry partners our pipeline security initiative. And so it was working across the country, tiering pipelines based on significance, priority, and relevance to the generation and movement of product. And we've been out there, we've conducted some boots on the ground assessments to get an understanding of what the security posture is. TSA has worked on this issue for a decade or more. They've issued guidance that has been generally well received. But what we are trying to do is get out there and get a better understanding of really what the security posture is. And so we'll do that through boots on the ground. Yeah. We'll do that by releasing self-assessment tools. But this is a priority area for us.
Have we seen evidence of attacks on cyber attacks on this infrastructure system?
So at the unclassified level, there a couple years ago, 2012, 2013, there was some targeting of pipelines. And so, we have an understanding what our pipeline infrastructure looks like, how the industrial control systems and operational technology works. But more importantly, what we have now, and in part what we can achieve through the National Critical Functions List, is it's not just about the grid. Because if you don't have baseload generation to feed the grid, then
Right.
it doesn't
Grid
matter
doesn't
if you have a
matter.
grid or not.
Right.
So what we're getting to is that interconnected nature of our infrastructure, and that developing that understanding, evolving our understanding, ensuring that we're aligning our resources and aligning our investments and aligning our initiatives, and so that we can look for those gaps. And so next year when we come back, we'll say, all right, you know what, through the course of this pipeline security initiative, we found some gaps here perhaps.
Okay.
And so we can roll that into the 21 budget, 22, 23, so on and so forth. But again, we're building awareness, we're improving our understanding, but we have a massive infrastructure here in the United States. And sometimes I'm a little jealous of my partners in maybe smaller geographies. We have massive infrastructure here, and we have a whole lot of work to do. And I appreciate the fact that I've had the chance to get up here and talk to you now twice this year, so we can share what our vision is, share what our plan is, because I'm not going to be able to do this alone. Industry's not going to be able to do this alone. You're not going to be able to do this alone. We've got to be able to do this together.
And so let me close with this, and I think something that you said earlier about the student from China and how much a university allows them into research and those kind of things. Look, I think that's an immigration issue that we need to look at. Why are we educating these individuals and then forcing them to go back to a country? Now, some may be coming here as bad actors just trying to get that intellectual property to go back. But many come here and want to stay here, and we're sending engineers back when we need engineers. So the immigration issue is one thing I think that really ties into this, actually. And then the other is, on that innovation side again, is our patent laws, where we're stifling innovation by not allowing by allowing people to in these disruptive innovations be drug out through the courts for years, and and finally these small inventors give up. And I think in this world of cyber particularly, we want to encourage all the innovation we can. And so I just throw that out to you as something that you may be able to help with as well.
And I'll try to do this as quickly as possible, recognizing that I'm over time here. The DNI released or declassified last year a slide, what's known as the Wheel of Doom or the Wheel of Death, and it basically shows the various tactics and techniques that the Chinese government is using to advance their economic interest. And it includes traditional espionage, it includes cybersecurity, intellectual property theft, but also appropriation of R&D, mergers and acquisitions, non-traditional collection. There's this whole suite of approaches they're using. It's very strategic, but it's actually manifesting tactically here today and over the past couple years. And this was one of the things that Secretary Nielsen, previous Secretary Nielsen, was focused on, but figuring out what are the department's levers that they can pull in response to the Wheel of Doom, working with the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, the full suite of interagency and USG capabilities. But your immigration point is one of them. But this goes back to my earlier point of, I think we have an inherent advantage as the United States of America, where we will always drive innovation. And it's a mighty attractive place to live, whether you're on the West Coast here or somewhere in between. This is a great place to be. This is a great place to live. This is a great place to work. It's a great place to raise a family. We need to take advantage of that, and we can operationalize that too.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Go ahead.
Just wanted you to mention, or I wanted to get on record, what's your focus, and where on the list of your critical function set is the agricultural food production, and what are you doing, if you can just briefly talk?
So food production and delivery is a critical function, as is water. These are the basic as FEMA would say, part of the lifeline sectors in terms of, you tell me 3 or 4 days after a hurricane runs through, whether it's the panhandle of Florida or whatever, and you don't have food, if you don't have water, how happy you're going to be. And so it's on the list of national critical functions. We have identified that. And so now, just generally on the critical functions piece, we're going into a prioritization cycle where we'll be working with both industry and the agencies that have sector-specific agency authority, in this case, Department of Agriculture. We'll be working with them to understand what their understanding of the risk is, what their initiatives are, what we can do together to help better align efforts. And ultimately, the concept here is we need to act, we need to prioritize, or we need to manage risk.
And more than just emergency situations from disasters, but from I was director of agriculture for our state, and one of the things that we were concerned with was people coming in and intentionally doing something to impair our ability to produce food, and so contaminations or spreading, rendering whole beef feedlots inoperable, different things like that. So I just wanted to make sure that was part of the thinking.
Yes, sir. So it's again, it's aligning the threat streams, what we may understand a bad actor may do, crossing it against the potential consequences. In your case, there are certainly a number of states that would have a really bad year if they were to lose their livestock.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no further questions, then the hearing will conclude. Thank you very much, Director, for being here, and look forward to following up on some things with you.